Hello and greetings everyone. I'm glad that you are tuning in and I hope you enjoy watching this video. Thanks for your time. This video will be about Pantheism in Asatru. Now this will be a two-part video, and in this part 1, we will be examining what Pantheism actually means, where it comes from and how it's related to Asatru, while the second part will consist of an in-depth view and analysis where pantheistic ideas and pantheism can be found in Asatru. Now, before we get started with the whole topic, we have to do a little bit of a definition of words. You see, pantheism is very often misunderstood and quite often thought to be something else. So, we have theism. Theism is the general idea that God and the creation are two separate things that have pretty much no ties with each other. God created the creation, but the two are completely apart from each other, and God is a transcendent being that is nowhere found inside the creation. Creation and God are apart. Then we have pantheism. Pantheism is the idea that God and the world are one, that the world is God, that God is omnipresent inside his own creation or her own creation, like you see in the Greek goddess Gaia, who basically is the creation goddess and the creation in itself. And the idea in pantheism is that everything inside the creation is a part of a greater God, an all God, or at least connected to the same divine source from which everything springs forth, may it be human, animal, plant, or a god. And then we have a quite new word creation, panentheism. Now, panentheism is the idea that God is both. He is on one side creation itself, and on the other side separated from creation. That means that everything that is a part of God, but God is much more than just this creation. He is much more a universal being that encompasses more than human minds can ever think of. That's panentheism. God is the creation and a hell lot more that no one can even imagine. And to point out, in panentheism, God is not the same as the creation, while in pantheism, God and creation are basically one and the same thing. So, now that we have cleared that up, I want to state that pantheism is not the same as monotheism, and it's not the same as polytheism either. The idea in pantheism is that there is one ultimate divine source, one all God or an oversoul, some divine source from where everything that is sprang forth and is created to it. That does mean that this being is, on the one hand, a separate entity, a bit like in monotheism, but on the same side is every single individual inside the creation as well, which is a polytheistic idea. Now, in monotheism we have one single God, and in polytheism we have many gods. In pantheism, both views can be pantheistic. That is not a problem in itself. A monotheistic pantheist would believe that there is just this one divine entity that encompasses everything. In a polytheistic view, this divine source is the thing that ultimately connects everything that is inside one divine source. That means all the gods, all the different gods still exist as separate individuals with their own personalities, but on an ultimate level they are all connected and all go back to the same source. Now, to have a better imagination what that actually means, just think of your own body. You experience yourself as one individual with one personality. But your body is actually made out of millions and millions of individual cells. Each cell in your body has its very own individuality, maybe even personality, we don't know for sure, but it is an individual that lives on its own and is connected to other cells, and you are as a whole the result of all your individual cells. And that's pretty much the pantheistic idea. Everything that is but a cell of the body that is ultimately this divine source. Now, a human may be, don't know, maybe a cell of the skin, while a god may be a finger or a hand or an organ. And so all life is basically a part of this greater being. Now, don't get confused. Monotheism means that there is just one God. And this can be this divine source, but doesn't have to be. In polytheism, we accept that there are many divine beings, and in pantheism, the two come closer to each other. Because in pantheism, everything is divine, which means that ultimately humans, plants, animals, everything is on an ultimate level divine, because it is connected to this divine source, and therefore everything is God. Now, on the other hand, for polytheists, this means that ultimately there is just one God, there is just one single entity, one single divine being. And that is a bit of a conflict, but it's not that problematic actually, as we will see in later examples of history. You can wire your brain around that for quite a while, but it does turn out well enough. Because in the end, it's not so different from what polytheists actually believe. We have ancestors and we are connected to them, maybe through this divine source. But it also states that this divine source in itself has no real personality, no real individual agendas, it just is. While everything else has them, so the gods of, let's say, Asatru could be connected and be a result of this divine source, and yet be their very own individual beings in their own right, just like humans are. And the gods would be like aspects of this divine source, maybe Thor, the strength, Odin, the wisdom, Frigg, the knowledge, and well, you can think of more. Now, I hope that has made things a bit clearer. Now we will go into history of pantheism. Now, the word pantheism doesn't exist for that long, and the word panentheism is just a few centuries old, but the idea of pantheism and panentheism stem back thousands of years. The first real, let's say the best evidence we have is Hinduism from already 6,000 years ago. Maybe even 6,000 BC, it depends on where you look at it and how you look at it. But in Hinduism we have a lot of stories of various sorts that are clearly pantheistic, and many, if not most, yogi and mystics from India actually have a pantheistic view of the universe. And yet it is a polytheistic religion and is clearly viewed as and presented as polytheistic religion, though its own holy text, the Bhagavad Gita, is clearly pantheistic, and as said, most mystics and yogi believe in a pantheistic view of their own religion and the world. What I wanted to stress out is that Hinduism and Asatru are very, very closely related. If there is any religion on this world that is closely related to Asatru than it is Hinduism. Hinduism and Asatru share the same roots and have quite some of the same history, share many gods, even names are very close, but I already made a video on that. So let's just keep in mind that pantheism is an omnipresent idea in Hinduism, and that the initiated into the religion, those who really learned it, are for the most part pantheists. There is even a word for this, Mahadevi. Mahadevi would translate as great god or great goddess. And in the Bhagavad Gita there are two gods that are called Mahadevi, Brahman and Shakti. And both are said to be the mask through which the ultimate divine being fuses into the world and acts in the world. There is even a story where Brahman himself splits himself into 1,000 separate entities, 1,000 beings, in order to help a group of people. So he himself split himself up into many beings and still was one and the same, which is a clear pantheistic statement that one being can split up into different personalities, different people, and still be one and the same. Now, other religions also had pantheistic ideas, like the cult of Demeter or the cult of Diana in Rome and in Greece, or the Egyptian Isis cult. And there was also the evolution of monotheism that based on pantheistic ideas in Egypt, where Ra was the divine all-god separate from creation, and Isis the all-god inside the creation itself, which finally led to Echnaton's idea of monotheism. Now we have evidence for that. Socrates said in his work Platos Phaedros in 250, "There was a time when the joyful saw a great beauty and got initiated. We who are the same as Zeus and the gods, who are calm and joyful and shine in divine light." While that's a bit hard to grasp, he is basically saying that he and those who know, those humans who are initiated, know that they are the same as the gods. Now you could understand that this means that Socrates may have thought that he has the same power or the same immortality as the gods, but I think we can be sure that Socrates knew that this was not the case. So what he meant was that he and the gods sprang forth from the very same source. That if the gods are a river and he's just a tiny part of water, tiny flow of water going into the river, they ultimately both come from the very same origin and will both end up in the sea. So having said that, let's move on to another one. Mark Aurel, or Marcus Aurelius, stated that there are three ways to experience gods: visions, dreams, and the initiation. And in the initiation, he said, the faithful sees that he is like the gods, connected to the same divine source. Likely, this view ultimately led to the idea that the Caesars are gods or sons of gods, which they often claim to be in order to establish their power. Cicero even got a step further and stated about the Demeter cult, I quote, as I did sometimes prior to that: "Athens gifted the world with holy initiation into the mysteries, that we too, like the gods, share the same divineness, not in power, but in divinity, which leads us to live happier, suffer through hardships easier, and approach death with hope." Now there were even whole temples dedicated to gods that seemingly were candidates for this pantheistic all-god, or seen as the incarnation of this pantheistic all-god into the pantheon of gods. Like Demeter had the following inscription on her temple: Through knowledge of mysteries, death is no more a danger to the living, but a blessing that leads to the union with gods. Could be interpreted in many ways, but Plutarch stated clearly when he wrote about the Egyptian goddess Neith, when he said that her temple read the following inscription. And this is clearly pantheistic, and I doubt you can interpret it in any other way, at least with some logic behind it. The temple said, I am all that is, all that has ever been, and all that ever will be. No one has seen more than me. And that is very pantheistic. But it doesn't stop there. We also have a reference from Apuleius, a Greek initiate in the 2nd century, who was said to be initiated into the cult of Isis, and that it was explained to him that Isis is the real god behind all other gods, who wears the other gods' personalities like masks are worn in a Greek play by the actors. And he later wrote the same about the goddess Demeter and stated that she and Isis are the same. And he wrote a poem, all creating, all being, who encompasses everything, ever present, who tells creation, firstborn, eternal, who knows all as you are all, I pray to you. Now, while Apuleius is a quite recent example, there are even older ones. The Assyrians had a pantheistic goddess called Nisaba, and Ur, the first woman in history to ever write something, actually wrote in her works that the god Ishtar and the goddess Inanna are the same being, one and the same entity, that split apart into two in order to have a better look on the creation. And this idea poured through pretty much all mystery cults until the modern times. If you look at medieval mystery cults or moderns like the Golden Dawn or other Hermetic orders, you will see this very idea present everywhere, that there is one being that is ultimately uniting everything else inside it, that is connected to everything and yet has no personality on its own, but uses avatars, gods, that stand for certain parts of this being, as we as humans could never grasp the whole thing in one piece. So it's split up in many gods, and each god is just one avatar of one aspect of this great entity. But it's not only a European idea. We even have ideas of pantheistic views and a clear pantheistic statement made by Lao Tse in China, and to some degree in South Africa as well. I haven't gotten too much into Native American belief systems, but if I'm not totally mistaken, at least the Maya also had a clearly pantheistic view of the creation. And I think the Aztecs might have too, but I have to re-research that, I guess. Anyway, let's move on. The important thing to note here is that pantheistic ideas were widespread all across the globe, mainly in Europe. And while we have no real evidence that the ancient Germanic tribes had been pantheistic, it is an assumption that can be made with some logic behind it and with some proof behind it. I mean, the ancient Germanic tribes basically had evolved a religion from the very same source that Hinduism sprang forth, and ultimately the same source that the Romano-Greco pantheon had as its origin. So we have at least 3 pantheistic religions that share the very same origin as Asatru. Now, while we could say that the pantheistic ideas got later into those religions, there is no evidence that it ever poured into those religions, and it's more safe to say that it has been present in this religion that was before the Indo-European religion. But pantheism was already an idea that is older than any of these religions and thus present in all. Just like all those religions have very similar gods and very similar names for those gods, and they often share very similar attributes. They got changed through culture, but pantheism is a very, very basic idea that very likely has been there from the very beginning, which would mean that the ancient Germanic tribes also would have at least known pantheism inside their own religion. Having said that, it would also explain why the Germanic people did never really have problems with other cultures' religions. I mean, even in the Viking Age, when the Christians and the heathens fought wars about religion, the Vikings and of course also the ancient Germanic tribes were very tolerant when it came to religion. It was like, believe in whatever you will, it's okay, it's fine. Just do your thing, I respect your gods as long as you respect mine. I mean, Vikings even attended to Christian celebrations and masses, so yeah, they had no problem respecting this view. And it would really explain why they did so if they were pantheistic, because in a pantheistic view, ultimately everyone prays to the one and the same God, one and the same beings. It would mean that it doesn't matter if you pray to Thor or pray to Mars or pray to Ares. Ultimately, they are one and the same. This can be viewed a bit like three sons looking at their father. Every son will experience his father a little bit different. One may see his father as a great warrior, the other may see him as a great lover, and the third may see his father as a very wise and very knowledgeable person. Now, there is one and the same entity, the father, that is viewed very differently from his three sons. Yet, and that's the important thing, he is ultimately one and the same being, and the three sons just have different opinions what is important about this being. Now, I don't say that Jupiter, Zeus, and Odin are one and the same entity. I don't believe that. I think they are separate entities, but I do believe that ultimately they are connected. They share the same divinity, which finally leads to the source. And this source may very well be Odin, as we will see in part 2 of this video. Now, let me just have a quick look at my notes. Yeah. Okay, now the last thing we need to know before we discuss the Pantheism Asatru, you have to keep in mind one thing. All stories and all songs inside the Edda were made up. They are fiction made by the skulls. I don't say that they have nothing real behind them, but they were ultimately fiction. They were stories. They were made to preserve history. They were made to teach religion, philosophy, and other things to people. They were made to be enjoyable because cults were paid by those who listened to them. And if they enjoyed the story, they would pay the cult better. So cults were interested in making money to make a living. And for that, they had to make the stories interesting, enjoyable. And so they couldn't just go and have speeches over 2 hours. They had to write songs. They had to write poetry. And for that, they may have used real life events as a base and then build some enjoyable things around that. Now, one example. We have the real life experience the real-life history of the Germanic tribes from Asia invading Scandinavia. The warlike Asian tribes met the peaceful European tribes from the Scandinavian megalithic cultures, and while the Asian invaders were very, very warlike and strong and cared a lot about diversity, the megalith cultures in Europe were peaceful, they were about art, they were about love. They were incestuous as far as we know, and here's the interesting thing. These two very different cultures were at war with each other and finally merged into one people, which we would know as the Germanic people. Now the important thing, we have Aesir invading from Asia. Some people believe that's where the name actually comes from. And we have the Vanir, the peaceful people in Europe. Now the Asian tribes clearly are very much like the Aesir, and the European tribes that were settled here, the megalithic cultures, are very much like the Vanir. Does that mean that the Aesir and the Vanir don't exist? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that seemingly people used real-life events to get their stories across. Or better said, they used the mythology to tell about real-life events. So the Aesir and Vanir war may have had two sides. There may have been a war amongst the gods, but it may also be a reference of mortals fighting each other, or both at the same time. Could very well be. Now, there's a point I want to get across. The Skalds wrote fiction about religion, about mysteries, philosophy, and many other things in Skaldic poetry. And that's the important thing. Skaldic poetry is very complex and very hard to understand. The people back then just loved riddles. So they would never ever address, okay, not never ever, but rarely address a being with its actual name. They would describe the being's attributes and hope that the listener would get who was meant. So they wouldn't say Odin, they would say One Eye, Greybeard, the Wanderer, and many other things. And they wouldn't say Heimdall, they would say the son of the nine mothers, or Great World, or anything else attributed to Heimdall, like the listener. And they would use these words instead of the names. That is very important when you read the Edda, because for the most part the names of the gods are not names. They weren't translated because the translators thought, hey, that's our names, we don't have to translate them. But in Old Norse they're actual words. So that is very important, because in the Edda there these very different names hint to one and the same being. They belong to one and the same being. And one and the same being in the Edda can have dozens of different names, which actually aren't names in their own right, but actually are just descriptions of this being, which will be very interesting in the story of Gangleri, where we see that Odin himself splits into 4 different entities, a bit like Brahma did in the Hinduistic sagas or Vedas, and talks to himself about the world. Those 4 people speak with each other, they communicate with each other, they tell stories to each other, they judge each other, and yet all 4 are one and the same being. But that is a video in its own right, and that will be covered in part 2. Thanks for listening. I hope my English wasn't too awful, and have a nice day. See you next time.